Australian universities are working against our national interests by collaborating with China's PLA scientists to develop military capacity. That's the claim in a new report which says our universities are being funded by predominantly Chinese students who are taking the knowledge back to their home country. The report published by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute says the scientists and engineers have worked on topics like signal processing, radar explosions and navigation systems. The report was produced by Alex Joske, researcher at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and he joins me now from Canberra. Also joining me is James Lawrence-Esson, Deputy Director of the Australian-China Relations Institute at the University of Sydney. Nice to have both of you with us. Alex, I want to start with you and the title of this report and what it tells us about the way that China sees the role of its scientists travelling abroad to study, and that is picking flowers, making honey. What's meant by that?
So this title, Picking Flowers, Making Honey, comes from a saying that the Chinese military uses to describe its overseas exchanges, the kinds of exchanges I've looked at in this report. So the full saying is, picking flowers in foreign lands to make honey in China. So essentially what they're doing is going overseas, getting training in high-tech fields with military applications such as navigation technology, supercomputers and navigation systems, and then going back to China and, to use the PLA's phrase, making honey with that in the form of applied military systems and technology.
Alex, I want to stay with you and just drill down a little bit of this and then come to James in just a moment. You particularly look at the National University of Defence Technology in China. Tell us about that university, its ties with the People's Liberation Army and the scientists that it is sending out to countries like Australia.
So the National University of Defence Technology is kind of like the Chinese military's Australian National University. It brings together all branches of the Chinese military and is directly subordinate to China's Central Military Commission. It produces some of the most advanced research of the Chinese military and works on specific military projects like hypersonic missiles, for example. And it's been the main source of scientists studying in countries like Australia, which has taken in about 300 Chinese military scientists in the past decade alone.
So how does their work coming out here, is that something that is orchestrated by the Chinese Communist Party, that these are hand-picked individuals sent out here to do a job, to study, to bring that information back, that every step of this is orchestrated?
I think to some extent this is part of a deliberate plan by the Chinese military that really began around a decade ago. So the term they use to describe the process of sending these scientists overseas is that they've selected and dispatched them overseas, and they're encouraged to work in fields and in top quality labs and environments overseas, work on ideas that they can then apply to military technology once they return to China.
James Lawrence-Esson, if you look at Alex's report, if you look at what he outlines in terms of the type of scientists who are coming to countries like Australia, the information that they are able to glean, the work that they're able to do, and then the benefits that come from that back in China, is this a case of Australian universities collaborating with the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese Communist Party, against the interests of Australia?
Yeah, I don't think you can put it in those simple terms. Look, let me be upfront. I think Alex's report raises some fair questions. In particular, if you read the report, he cites some examples of where some Chinese scholars have misrepresented their backgrounds. Well, that's a legitimate question.
And when you say misrepresenting their backgrounds, you know, in the report it points out that they lie about which organisations they're representing, their own particular fields of study, that clearly suggesting that there is something more sinister here.
Right. I mean, if someone's doing that, then I think Australia has every right to be asking questions. So I'm glad Alex is asking those sorts of questions. That said, I certainly don't think it's as simplistic as the PLA is coming to Australia to take over our advanced knowledge, because there's a bigger context here. And one of the pieces of information that I think is pretty important is that if you look at the world's top 50 universities in science and technology, 10 of them are in China. In Australia, we only have one. So look, this is a complex issue. China's rise presents challenges, Stan, to Australia. There's no getting around that. Look at its behaviour in the South China Sea, disregarding an arbitration decision international arbitration decision in 2016, militarising those reclaimed land features. Look at the way the Chinese government is treating its minority Uyghur population in Xinjiang. These are of real concern to Australia, not least of all because we have Australian citizens who say they can't contact their family members anymore, or they're scared to do so because they're worried they'll put those family members under threat. So China presents challenges, there's no argument with that, but at the same time, China also presents enormous opportunities. So we need to make sure our responses are based on facts and evidence.
James, the starting point for your report is that this is a rival military which is gaining a benefit from having its scientists study in Australia. Can I just challenge that assumption? Is China in fact an enemy? It is our single biggest trading partner. We collaborate in many different ways, and there's been some defence collaboration in the past, Alex, as well. Is the assumption here that this is a rival military, that it is somehow an enemy, is that assumption fundamentally wrong right now?
Well, it plays.
Sorry, Alex, James, and I'll come back to you.
Sure.
I think we've seen the Chinese military behave much more aggressively and, frankly, in an expansionist way in places like the South China Sea, where it's acted unilaterally to seize those islands. And we're also seeing the Australian government spend billions of dollars to essentially compete with China in the Pacific. So at the same time, to collaborate with the Chinese military, train its best scientists, and then let them go back to China and develop military systems that can be used against us, not just in a conflict, but for surveillance, for intelligence gathering, and also to shore up their installations in the South China Sea, simply undermines our other efforts in this area.
So the starting point here, and no one's naive, as James has suggested as well, we don't know what China's ultimate intentions are, and if we look at its actions in places like the South China Sea, there are causes for concern. But what you're saying here fundamentally, Alex, is China is not to be trusted.
I think the key thing is that regardless of whether or not we think China should be trusted, it's not in our interest to continue this collaboration in high-tech fields like supercomputing technology. For example, the University of New South Wales has trained many scientists from the Chinese military's supercomputer program who have then gone back to China to work on that supercomputer program. The Chinese military's supercomputer program is also used for nuclear weapons testing and designing advanced aircraft, and that simply doesn't contribute to our national interest. I'd also like to add that it's important to distinguish between collaboration with China, much of which is beneficial, and which we should continue, with collaboration with the Chinese military, which presents a different set of challenges.
And that is the sort of line here, isn't it, James? That on the one hand there is business to business, people to people contact with China, but then there is the Chinese Communist Party, the People's Liberation Army. How do we navigate that space and decide what is in our interests and what is not?
Well, I think we take a very hard look at what these students are actually doing here, Stan. One of the data points Alex points out in his report is Chinese students coming here doing PhD programs. And the narrative around that is that they're being sent here to suck up our advanced technology and then take it back to China and apply it to their military program. Well, that's not how a PhD works, Stan. If you're going to complete a PhD in Australia, you actually need to create new knowledge. That's the fundamental requirement of the degree. And if you don't do that, you won't get the degree. Let's be clear, if Chinese students are creating knowledge while they're here, and Alex says that's of benefit to the People's Liberation Army, well, it's equally beneficial to the Australian Defence Forces and by virtue of the fact that we're a US security ally to the US military forces as well. So I think the problem for me is that this report fundamentally misunderstands the nature of university research, which is collaborative.
I'll get a response to Alex from that. I mean, if students are coming here and they're completing original work, they're completing their PhD theses, they're having this work published in peer-reviewed publications, English publications, they're not hiding anything in that case, are they, Alex?
Just focusing on the members of the Chinese military who have come here overtly and who haven't tried to hide their background, they're still coming here with the intention of gaining new skills and primarily for training. In a PhD program, you do have to produce new knowledge, but for most of these students coming here, they complete their PhDs back in China after spending about a year or two in Australia. So for a technology like supercomputers, it's simply not in our interest when they're going back to China and then applying that technology for things like nuclear weapons testing and designing advanced aircraft.
Alex, you look at several universities, one of them is Curtin University, which says that there is nothing illegal that it is doing. There is no law that's being broken in working with some of these scientists and these students who are coming out here, and that this is for civilian purposes. What do you say to, when a university like Curtin says, look, nothing to see here?
The Chinese military, if you look at its own writings, is really the best source on what's going on in this phenomenon. They're really clear about the fact that they're going overseas to develop military technology, to gain the knowledge to improve their fighting power. So it's simply ludicrous to suggest that Chinese military scientists being sent overseas would be working on technology just for civilian purposes. And on the issue of the legality of this, I think it really reflects a gap in our current legislation of export controls, because currently they only apply to transfers of technology by individuals in Australia to individuals outside of Australia, so that they actually don't attempt to manage the kinds of research collaboration that I've focused on in my report.
James, Alex has a point here, doesn't it? We know that China is active in cyberspace and allegations of being involved in cyber espionage, involved in cyber warfare. We know that China is rapidly building its military. You've talked there about, just a moment ago, about its intentions in the region and the way that it ignores international rulings that go against its interests. That there is real concern here, and if this is the case, we know they also run a works program where they specifically go out to try to access information elsewhere and to be able to turn that to its advantage, that essentially we are making it easier for them.
Well, I don't think it's easy at all, Stan. I mean, the reality is that we have defence export controls in this country, overseen by the Department of Defence. Those were only reviewed 3 years ago and made stronger. It's also a fact that our defence export controls are actually tougher than those in the US. US rules say that science and technology universities the export controls don't apply if they're undertaking basic and applied research and the findings of that research is published in peer-reviewed journals. Well, that's precisely the data that Alex is presenting in his report. Think about that, Stan. We're saying that they've come here, they've acquired our knowledge, they've gone back to China, they've then sent those findings to a journal based in America and published them in English. I mean, that's pretty extraordinary. How helpful.
And of course, there are those who are looking on and saying that, James, you're here and you work for the Australia-China Relations Institute. You would say this, wouldn't you? Because this was set up by money from a wealthy Chinese businessman, Huang Xiangmo, who had to step down later as chairman of the institute because of the perceptions that it was too close to China and the Communist Party.
Right, step down because of the perceptions. And thanks for the question, Stan. I mean, let's run through the facts. I started off by talking about how important the facts are. On Huang Xiangmo's donation to UTS,
$1.8 million to help set up the institute.
Exactly, over 3 years, and that was declared in a UTS press release in 2013. Julie Bishop, when she launched ACRI in 2014, she thanked and acknowledged Huang Xiangmo's donation. It's in our annual reports. In 2016, as you said, the money finished. For the last 2 years, we haven't had any money from Huang Xiangmo, and yet we still get these questions over and over again raised about the integrity of ACRI research. I've had people question me because I support the Australia-China Free Trade Agreement, and they say that means I'm pro-China. Really? I would have thought supporting the Free Trade Agreement meant that I'm pro-Australia.
Alex, you also finished the report with a whole range of suggestions. One of them is that there must be tighter controls on the flow of this type of information technology, and that the government may need to intervene where universities are failing, perhaps even tighter restrictions on visas. What would you like to see as the next steps here?
I think the most important first step is simply to have the kind of discussion we're having right now, where universities and government are coming together and discussing the kinds of collaboration we're participating in with China and whether or not that's in our national interests. It's clear that a lot of collaboration with China is beneficial, but we need to draw the line somewhere. And that a policy that comes out of this deliberative process should then inform legislative responses. So those legislative responses and policies could take the form of expanded export controls that actually limit transfers of technology between individuals in Australia and members of the Chinese military in Australia, which would be bringing it up to the same regulations as many countries around the world. We're actually behind a lot of other countries in this respect. And we also need better visa screening to ensure that people who are coming here clearly with the intent of gaining knowledge and technology in Australia for the Chinese military aren't let in.
James, we only have a minute or so left. Does that sound reasonable to you? Tighter export controls, and you raised this before. If someone is lying about their background, that they shouldn't be allowed in. More stringent visa restrictions as well to see who is coming here and what the intent is.
Yeah, look, whether they're from China or any other country, I would say. Stan, just one other point for me to finish on is that if we're going to start saying we can't cooperate with China on things like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, then
China leads the world in a lot of that.
Well, that's exactly my point. Then we're going to be shutting ourselves off from the world's best technology. The reality is, in the next 10 years, more and more of the world's best technology is going to come out of China. We've got to put in place systems so that we can manage the risks, but also actively engage with China in producing and using that research. We can't just ban every Chinese technology company. We need a more sophisticated approach.
There is another question. We don't have time for it, but just how willing is China to share its secrets with us? We'll have to save that for another day. James, good to see you as always. Alex, thank you so much, and thanks for writing the report and appearing on the program tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.